Okay, we are live.
Hi. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Today is April 29th, Friday evening, 9 p.m. in United States. And we are gathered again for our weekly or now bi-weekly seminar session for ICHRRF Professor Ved Nanda Fellowship Training Program. My name is Dr. Adityanjee, and I am the Fellowship Training Director. And I have a couple of slides. This is the logo of the ICHRRF, which you see in all our programs. And of course, on behalf of the Board of Directors and the executive team of the ICHRRF, I invite all our audience to yet another seminar in this Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program. And this is the list of our distinguished faculty, starting with Professor Ved P. Nanda, Professor Yashwant Pathak, Professor Nalini Rao, who is here today, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, Mr. Clemens, Mr. Tripathi, who is our legal director, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, and very recently, Professor Nidhi Shandurnikar joined as one of our faculties. So as far as current fellows, we have only one fellow left at this point in time, and that is Ripudaman Pachori, who will be making a presentation today. We have a standard format, which is like 25 minutes presentation by the fellow, 10 minutes of comments by chief mentor, which is Professor Ved Nanda, a 25 minutes discussion by the faculty preceptor, and a 30-minute question and answer session. So it's very neatly structured. I know that Professor Ved Nanda is out of country. He probably will not be able to join, so we'll utilize that 10 minutes giving it to fellow. The topic of today's seminar is slavery in 21st century. And that's a very important topic from human rights perspective. And the fellow making the presentation is Mr. Ripudaman Pachori. Before I formally start the presentation by Ripudaman Pachori, I have two slides here. So this came in Harvard Law Today. And the slide says, in the honor of the enslaved, whose labor created wealth that made possible the founding of Harvard Law School. May we pursue the highest ideals of law and justice in their memory. And this is the epitome of slavery in this country. This entire country was made by slave labor, and Harvard Law School, in Harvard Law Today, very recently, in an article acknowledged that without the slave labor and without the wealth created by slave labor, founding of Harvard Law School was not possible. Around few thousand miles away from United States, this is a slide from migrant labor in a detention camp in Saudi Arabia. See people in this detention camp lying half naked in a very crowded condition. And that's happening today. It's not a thing of past, it's happening today. A few announcements. We are currently having two candidates' application for July 22 session. We are not sure what will happen, but we have 2 applications to consider. Tomorrow we are having a very special session, a special event. In December of 2021, the ICHRRF conducted a special hearing on ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide of minorities in Bangladesh. Tomorrow is the day when ICHRRF will release a formal report. We have put out our announcements, and I will encourage all of you to be able to join briefly for this session of release of report ceremony. It starts 11 a.m. Eastern Daytime in US, and it'll be 8:30 p.m. by India time. We did conduct a special hearing on Kashmiri Hindu genocide in month of March. And in month of March, Professor Arvind Sharma joined as member of International Advisory Board. Before we went on air formally, I was talking to Professor Rao, and she's encouraging some of our students to apply for fellowship program. So I will invite all of you who are present to refer people for our fellowship program. And if there are prospective volunteer faculty, we will be happy to talk to them. Certain housekeeping rules. Kindly mute yourself to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone settings to vibration mode. Please do not try to interrupt the fellow or the faculty preceptor when they are speaking. If there are people in the audience, they will not be allowed to ask questions if they are anonymous. You have to be present with your name, your identification. But if you join anonymously, we will not let you answer questions. All the questions are to be sent by chat function. While asking questions, please be very precise and specific. Kindly don't send comments in the form of a lecture or a monologue. Lastly, this session is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website as a resource material, because these fellowship seminars are quite informative. So with that introduction, I'm going to invite our fellow Ripudaman Pachori to make his presentation on slavery in 21st century. I know that he has an extensive presentation. I read it. It was a 9-page long document. So Ripudaman, the floor is yours. And as I said, Professor Nanda is not here today, so his time goes to you.
All right. Thank you, Adityanjee. Uh, thank you for giving me opportunity to present on this topic. I'll start. The slavery in the 21st century comes in various forms. In this presentation, I'm trying to scratch the surface to define the key concepts and the reasons for or the driving factors and the steps taken or should be taken by the states, various governments, and the non-government parties or institutions. The humanitarian aid in terms of electronics or war equipments, safe water, food, forced migration from war zones under the shadow of the rescue missions are the instruments of enforced slavery. As the slave, a person or a group often forced to sign contracts under deep stress of poverty or deprivation of essential resources. I'm going to refer a fact sheet by International um, Labor Organization on the topic of modern slavery, the concept and their practical implications. Research Research by International Labour Organization has shown the alarming scale and persistence of forced labor today with an estimated 21 million people subjected to forced labor worldwide, generating an estimated US $150 billion in an annual profits. This is what Dr. Adityanjee showed the picture about that people are forced, like in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the world, and the profit goes to the country who are basically hosting those forced laborers or immigrants. The staggering scale of the forced labor and the huge profits that they are generated on the backs of trafficked and enslaved people have called policymakers to action. The prohibition prohibition of slavery, forced labor, institutions, and practice similar to the slavery and trafficking in person are enshrined in international law. However, debates about the relationship between these concepts and how should be translated into domestic laws have at times led to confusion about how best to tackle the enormous challenges posed by contemporary forms of forced labor, or what is often called modern form of slavery. In addition to examining the different concepts themselves, it can also be useful to develop a typology of the main forms of co- uh, coer- coercion, that is, the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats, or severe exploitation in different countries, and to examine the way that these can be addressed more effectively through different kinds of laws and policy response. A starting point for such typology, building on those developed by the International Labour Organization over the past decade, could be something like this: coercion exacted by the state, coercion in conflict situations. Long-standing problems of coercion linked to poverty and discrimination and deeply embedded in the um, agrarian and social structure and culture of many developing countries. Structural concerns linked to contemporary globalization, including issues linked to migration, labor market issues, including the role of recruitment intermediaries and the role of the private sector in eradicating coercion from business practices and company supply chains. These four categories are approximate and could doubtless be refined and built upon, but they are a starting point for analyzing the usefulness or relevance of the different concepts in addressing the various concerns in practice. I'm also going to refer another fact sheet from UNHCR, UNHCR fact sheet number 14, Contemporary Forms of Slavery. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Slavery, the modern reality. The word slavery today covers a variety of human rights violation. In addition to traditional slavery and the slave trade, these abuses include the sale of children, child prostitution, child pornography, child exploitation of child labor, the sexual mutilation of female children, the use of children in armed conflicts, debt bondage, the traffic in person, and in the sale of human organs, the exploitation of prostitution, and their practices under apartheid and colonial regimes. There is enough evidence, however, to show that slavery-like practices are vast and widespread. Just one figure tells a grim story. 100 million children are exploited for their labor. According to a recent estimate by International Labour Organization, uh, this uh, this is part of one of the fact sheet that 100 million people around the world are being exploited as a labor. As a contribution to the campaign to raise public awareness of human rights and issues, this fact sheet describes the modern forms of slavery as well as the work done at the international level to halt and prevent it. Aspects of slavery. They also reveal that there are no clear distinction between different forms of slavery. The same families and group of peoples are often the victims of several kinds of modern slavery. For example, bonded labor, forced labor, child labor, or child prostitution with extreme poverty as a common linking factor. Child labor uh, is in the great demand because it is cheap and because children are naturally more docile, easier to discipline than adults, and too frightened to complain. Child labor are often hard and hazardous, damages health of life, deprives children of education and the normal enjoyment of their early years. Children be excluded from most hazardous form of work as defined by the World Health Organization and International Labour Organization by 1995. All forms of labor for children under the age 10 outlawed by International Labour Organization Convention number 138 be eliminated, and that those regarding children in the 10 to 14 years of age group be halved by the year 2000. Another statistics from International Labour Organization uh, uh, from a published paper titled Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work Branch. About 160 million children are and 63 million of the girls and 97 million of boys out of those are victims of child labor, accounting for almost 1 in 10 of all children worldwide. 79 million children, nearly half of all those in child labor, perform hazardous work that directly endangers their health, safety, and moral development. 40.3 million people are in modern slavery, including 24.9 in forced labor and 15.4 million in forced marriages. 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery are children. Children in armed conflicts. Forcible recruitment of children into military service has been reported in many parts of the world. The consequences are devastating. Many have died or been disabled in armed operations, while others have been interrogated, tortured, beaten, or kept as prisoners of war. The traffic in person and sexual exploitation, the recruitment, clandestine transport and exploitation of women as prostitutes, and the organized prostitution of children of both sexes in a number of countries is well documented. A link has been established in some places between prostitution and pornography, particularly involving children, and the promotion and the growth of tourism. Sale of children on surplus go-betweens have found that large profits can be made by arranging the transfer of children from poverty-stricken homes to people with means without guarantees and supervision to ensure that the child's interests will be protected. In such cases, financial gain for the parents as well as the intermediaries takes on the character of trading in children. There have been many cases we have observed in past in many third world countries where the poor children are being adopted by um, the parents living in the Western countries and Europe and America, and uh, that is that kind of slavery um, is basically directly linked this um, with the people, the Western people, Western parents. Uh, that bondage can hardly be distinguished from traditional slavery because it prevents the victim from leaving his job or the land he it tills until the money is repaid. Although, in theory, a debt is repayable over a period of time, a situation of bondage arises when in spite of all his efforts. The borrowers cannot wipe it out. Normally, the debt is inherited by the bonded laborer's children. Sharecropping is a familiar way of leading borrowers into debt bondage. Major difficulties faced by immigrants, migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, with respect to their right to health. Migrants are generally inadequately covered by state health system and are often unable to afford health insurance. Migrant sex workers and undocumented migrants in particular have little access to health and social services. Migrants have difficulties accessing information on health matters and available services. Often the information is not provided adequately by the state. Undocumented migrants dare not access health care for fear that health providers may denounce them to immigration authorities. Female domestic workers are particularly vulnerable to sexual abuse and violence. Migrant workers often work in unsafe and unhealthy conditions. Migrant workers may be more prone to risky sexual behavior owing to their vulnerable situation. As far away from their families and their exclusion from major prevention and care programs on sexually transmitted diseases like HIV and AIDS. Their situation is therefore conducive to the rapid spread of their disease. Conditions in the centers where undocumented migrants are detained may also be conducive to the spread of disease. Trafficked persons are subject to physical violence and abuse and face formidable hurdles related to their right to reproductive health, like sexually transmitted diseases, including infections with HIV, unwanted pregnancies, and unsafe abortions. Apartheid and colonism. Apartheid is not simply a racial discrimination problem to be solved through education and political reforms. In essence, it has disposed the black population of South Africa by imposing a quasi-colonial system through coercive measures. The labor of the indigenous people has been harnessed for the profit of white investors by suppressing the human rights of entire population. Apartheid and the other forms of colonialism have the effect of collective or group slavery. In pernicious quality is that the subject peoples have no choice. They are born into a state of slavery and have very little, if any, means of appealing against it. Slavery, according to International Labor Organization, a recent paper is also defined as a state of mind. As a legally permitted labor system, traditional slavery has been abolished everywhere. but it has not been completely stamped out. There are still reports of slave markets. Even when abolished, slavery leaves traces. It can persist as a state of mind among its victims and their descendants, and among the inheritors of those who practiced it long after it has formally disappeared. I'm also going to refer another fact sheet from UNHCR fact sheet number 31, Right to Health. A key aspect of the right to health contains freedoms. These freedoms include the right to be free from non-consensual medical treatment, such as medical experiments and research or forced sterilization, and to be free from torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishments. The right to health contains entitlements. These entitlements include the right to a system of health protection providing equality of opportunity for everyone to enjoy the highest attainable level of health, the right to prevention, treatment, and control of diseases, access to essential medicine, material, maternal, child, and reproductive health, equal and timely access to basic health services. The link between the right to health and other human rights. The human rights are interdependent, indivisible, and interrelated. This means that violating the right to health may often impair the enjoyment of other human rights, such as the right to education or work, and vice versa. Slavery as an idea. There is a conventional type of slavery where strong people or a stronger group um, dominates a weaker person or weaker group. The second type of slavery is religious or socio-cultural slavery. It is prominent in Africa as well as areas of Asia and Southeast Asia, where often members of the same ethnicities and communities were enslaving one another. There's a um, there's a document written by Nunn in 2004 um, that has the facts related to this comment. In some communities, penance for a sin or crime is performed by delivering a young child, typically a daughter, to the local priest, as is the case with the, uh, if I'm pronouncing correct, uh, Trokosi tribe in Ghana. This is a perennial penance. So when the slave dies, another must be given in her place. Although this is religious and cultural in nature, there is an economic factor. Although laws in Ghana make this practice illegal, no one is freed without a payment, and no one has been arrested. The laws in this case are ineffective for lack of implementation. In Ghana, there are about 3,000 known women slaves. Compare this number to the estimates by the US State Department showing that 600,000 to 800,000 persons are trafficked across borders annually, usually for forced labor or sexual servitude. The US Department of State 2005 Trafficking in Person Report quotes that DOSTIP. This number does not include incidents of interstate trafficking, which would yield far greater numbers. Brief historical overview of um, abolition of slavery. It is a historical practice that has only in the last 150 years or so become a national and international debate, largely coinciding with the rise of industrialization in the West. Many religious leaders pushed to abolish slavery in its legal format, such as Quaker Benjamin Lay in 1737, Jonathan Edward, William Lloyd Garrison, Library of Congress, African American Odyssey. The war between the states ended legal slavery in America, and about 50 years later, the League of Nations ratified the Slavery Convention in 1926, which sought to suppress and abolish all forms of slavery. The UN General Assembly in 1953 and 1956 amended the Slavery Convention to bring it in line with UN protocols and augment the definitions and expectations. Other important documents include the Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Person and of the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others in 1949, the Abolition of Forced Labor Convention 1957, and Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, Punish Trafficking in Person, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crimes, year 2000, not in force, UNHCR, a compilation of international instruments. The attention that the issue has been getting even as recent as 2000 from the 21st century slavery, five international communities indicates that slavery and human trafficking is still a major issue in a global context. Now I'm going to, uh, I actually have already started, but I'm going to um, tell what are the steps taken by the international communities, the governments, and the non-government organizations to prevent these kind of um, crimes, I would say. The international concerns with slavery and its suppression is the theme of many treaties, declarations, and conventions of the 19th and the 20th centuries. The first of three modern conventions directly related to the issue is the Slavery Convention in 1926, drawn up by the League of Nations. With the approval of the General Assembly, the United Nations formally became the successor of the League in the application of the Slavery Convention in 1953. States which have ratified the convention by 1990 had done so undertake to prevent and suppress the slave trade and to bring about the abolition of slavery in all its forms. In 1949, the General Assembly adopted the Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Person and of the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others. This legal instrument consolidated other international agreements dating back 1904. The procurer, rather than the prostitute, is the target of the convention. It requires state parties to introduce measures designed to prevent prostitution and to rehabilitate the prostitutes. States ratifying or assenting to the convention, they numbered 60 by the end of 1990, also undertake to check the traffic in person of either sex for the purpose of prostitution and to do away with laws, regulations, special registrations, and other requirements of persons who are engaged or suspected of engaging in prostitution. In 1926 Convention's definition of slavery was broadened to include the practices and institutions of debt bondage, servile forms of marriage, and the exploitation of children and adolescents in the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the slave trade, and institutions and practices similar to slavery, adopted at the UN Nation Conference in Geneva in 1956. The Supplementary Convention has been ratified or acceded to by 106 states. The Working Group on the Contemporary Form of Slavery in the United Nations body, which receive information from state on the steps they have taken to implement the three slavery-related conventions. A number of other relevant conventions have been adopted and are supervised by international labor organizations. Actions in the United Nations. The Working Group on Contemporary Form of Slavery has the general responsibility in the United Nations for the study of slavery in all its aspects. Meeting for the first time in 1975 as the Working Group on Slavery, the group was renamed in 1988. The working group consists of 5 independent experts chosen on the basis of their fair geographical representation from the membership of the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. The group meets for 1 week each year and reports to the Subcommission. In 1990, the members of the working group were Fatma Zohra Kesantini from Algeria, chairperson, Ion Daconu from Romania, um, S. Bujon Adi from Norway, Walid Saadi from Jordan, and Susan Monroe from Colombia. In addition to monitoring the application of the Slavery Convention and making a review of the situation in different parts of the world, the group selects a theme for special attention each year. In 1989, the theme was Prevention of the Sale of Children, Child Prostitution, Child Pornography, and in 1990, Eradication of the Exploitation of the Child Labor and Debt Bondage. In 1991, the theme is the prevention of the traffic in person and exploitation of the prostitution of others. Programs of national and international action to deal with the problems raised by the first two themes have been drafted by the working group, which expects to receive reactions to its proposal from the governments and a wide range of organizations. In 1992, the working group expects to evaluate its study of the three themes and to take up the idea of an international pledge conference to help put an end to the exploitation of child labor. There are two documents again I am going to refer. One is the Special Action Program to Combat Forced Labor, SAP-PFL. Um, it's a document, a study by International Labor Organization that says since 2002, the Special Action Program to Combat Forced Labor has spearheaded the International Labor Organization's work by one, raising global awareness and understanding of modern forced labor, assisting governments to develop and implement new laws, policies, and action plans, developing and disseminated the disseminated guidance and training materials on key aspects of forced labor and trafficking, implementing innovative projects which combine policy development, capacity building of law enforcement and labor market institutions, and targeted field-based projects to direct support for both prevention of forced labor and identification and rehabilitation of its victims. Uh, Other than the government and non-government institution, there is a role for everyone else as well. The essential base of international covenants, international legislation, and enforcement procedures is established, but long experience has shown that official action alone will not stamp out slavery in its various forms. Attitudes and customs, often deep-rooted, must change. People move to the plight of the victims of modern forms of slavery, particularly where children are concerned, are constantly writing to United Nations. In their letters, they often ask the question, what can I do? The answer is that everyone has a contribution to make to the world order, which no longer tolerates inhuman exploitation. There are many things that can be done at the national and the local levels by association and by every individual. I'll rest my presentation here, Mr. Carl and Dr. Adityanjee, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ripudaman, for an excellent overview of slavery in 21st century. As I said that, I was willing to give you extra time because when I reviewed your write-up, I was deeply impressed. And I'll tell you that you need to convert this into a form of a paper by putting references, and we shall publish it on our website as a resource material because it is that extensive. And I really sort of, appreciate the hard work you have done. It will help a lot of people, because so much of information has been compiled. So our traditional format is that once the fellow presents, the faculty preceptor does the discussion followed by Q&A. Having said that, we are a very small group today. So I'm going to sort of make some changes here. And I'm going to have Q&A first before I give my comments. And again, we are a very small group. So I'll give everyone an opportunity to make some comments or ask questions. And I'll start with Professor Rao, who's the senior most person amongst us. So Professor Rao, any comments or questions you may have? I think you need to unmute yourself, Professor Rao. Carl, can you unmute Professor Rao?
I can send her an unmute request. One second, let me do that.
I don't think she knows how to unmute herself.
Mute me.
Yes, there you are. We can hear you now.
Okay, all right. So I just had one question. If migrants are coming here or any other country, they were not well off in the first place in their own country. When they come here and they're forced to work or don't have health insurance, they were no better there. They were worse there. Therefore, they are here. But how can you judge them from our perspective? Otherwise, they should not have come. They know that they're undocumented. They know that they don't have health insurance, right? How can the government do everything for them when they just come and don't come legally? They were worse off there. So how can we call them a slavery? You have given them a job at least they have some food to eat. They didn't even have that there.
Professor Rao, this is a very philosophical notion. Let me ask Ripudaman. He raised a point. Ripudaman, if you want to answer, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Adityan. So, yeah, superficially, it makes sense, Dr. Professor Nandi Rao, what you said. But how about instead of forcing someone and bringing that person or group of person as a labor, or migration of undocumented laborers? Um, that is a superficial scenario. But how about forcing or creating an environment at that place? For example, in Mexico, the agricultural industry has been destroyed. Okay, that force the farmers to migrate for better opportunities. Another example is of the current conflict which is going on with Ukraine, right? So, the whole war was started um, because some people do not want Ukraine to join EU, right? European Union, right? But the people who are supporting Ukraine, they themselves did not basically quit the European Union. I'm giving the example of UK. UK had BR exit, right? They do not want to join, so they understand what is the problem with that, but they are supporting Ukraine to fight to join EU, right? And because of that, this conflict has been created. The whole drama has been created, and who are being benefited by it? The population there, especially women and children who are uh, educated, they are forced to move in different part of the world where they have to compromise with the contracts. They have to bargain for their living, you know, because they are forced to move out from that country, right?
Ripudaman, I'm going to intervene here.
Yeah.
I think we are going away from the earlier notion that is much more geopolitical issue, and let's not get drawn into it.
Mm-hmm.
But coming to Professor Rao's question, so, and this is peculiar, let's say, to United States only, that people want to come from wherever because it's the land of the opportunity. And the moralistic philosophical point from a utilitarian perspective is that people having worse conditions in home country, so if they come and they are treated in a different manner than the United States population, there's nothing wrong with it because at least they have a job and they can save more money. It's a kind of very patronizing argument, and I'll tell you why. First is that once that person lands on the shore, that person becomes subject to the US laws. Whether they are legal, illegal, they become. But have you seen there's a massive industry that colludes with the traffickers? People, even if they want to come, they have to spend money and pay to the traffickers, even in this country, even to traffic them across the Mexican border. So there are gangs that are trafficking people. Whose responsibility is to bust those gangs? That responsibility lies with United States government. It is also the responsibility of United States government to create legal situation in which farm work is productive. You know, when you have a situation that US citizens will not do farm work, and you have a wink wink nod nod situation in which the government on one hand says that this is illegal but does everything to foster servitude bonded labor in the farm sector. And that's the reality of today. In 2018, the Global Slavery Index estimated that there are 403,000 slaves in United States. And majority of these actually are in farm sector. There was a major case in which a group of migrant workers from India were brought by a quote unquote staffing agency and made to work on a shipyard under bonded laborer servitude conditions. So you're talking about the fairness of the system, fairness of the law. And when we say that it is responsibility of everyone, including the governments, including the businesses that hire, if you are allowing unscrupulous staffing agencies that actually indulge in human trafficking, you are conniving in violation of the international law. So it's a parsimonious argument that these people were worse off in their own countries. Yes, migration of human beings is determined by very complex, socio-economic dynamics. But that should not be used to justify it by an advanced country exploitation of human beings. That is what I would say, Professor Rao. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. So is the same thing happening when migrants go to France? Are they also doing the same thing?
Well, if I may change the context, okay, there are domestic maids going from Indonesia, going from Sri Lanka, going from Philippines, going from India to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, you're right.
You know what happens to them? Okay, I just change, if we change our frame of reference and if we keep our eyes and ears open, almost all these maids, domestic maids, are sexually exploited. Their passports are taken away by their employer, never to be returned back. They are not paid wages. They are made to work sometimes 18 hours and 19 hours. They are starved. What more than you can say that these are slaves and these are sexual slaves who basically have been exploited by the system. Saudi Arabia has a system called kifala system, which is a legal system by that country's jurisprudence. In kifala system, there will be a quote unquote local sponsor for a migrant worker. And this person is a Lord and Almighty for that particular migrant worker. You have to turn in your passport the moment you land. You cannot change the employer. Okay? You cannot change the employer. And if the kifala owner or whatever does anything to you, you have no recourse to the law. So yes, it happens in a lot of countries. Let's not just talk about France. Let's talk about whole of the Middle East. In country of Kuwait, 9 out of 10 households have domestic maid servants.
Yeah.
You have time and again cases come when these domestic maid servants have murdered their oppressors out of frustration because they could not escape. So we have, exploitation of migrant labor by preying upon the vulnerabilities. And if the government of the country is complicit, then the international community needs to speak out. They need to call out. So it's not just US versus Latin American countries, people are coming from for jobs and all that sort of thing. It's a very complex system, and it has led to, sort of strained diplomatic relations between Philippines and Saudi Arabia and Sri Lanka and Saudi Arabia because of, ongoing exploitation.
Right.
Actually, at one point in time, Indonesian government banned Indonesian maids to go to Malaysia. Now, both of these are like neighboring countries. One is rich, one is prosperous, the other one is poor, heavily crowded. Indonesia is very poor, the average people. But because Indonesian maids were being exploited by Malaysian, households and ill-treated, Indonesian government actually banned the migration of, now you could say that, they are already poor. If they go to Malaysia, they get more money and all that sort of thing. But their civil rights were being violated. So it does create a problem.
Yeah,
I would also like to add, like in these countries, like women are used as a weapon of war also. In many armies, like in China, Japan, and other parts of the world, um, the women have been taken and kept as prostitute to serve the army. And this is not just China, Japan. During World War II also, the Allied forces also did the same thing. They rescued German from the oppression of Hitler, but then the German women and the girls had to face this kind of treatment
It's
also.
true, but that is like, Second World War. I can tell you this happened in 21st century, not in
Yeah.
20th century. If anyone remembers the sexual slavery and exploitation of Yazidi women by the ISIS, that was supported actually by United States government, by Obama government. It was the stated policy of Obama government to promote ISIS as a counterbalance to Syria led by Assad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in that process, you directly or indirectly participated in genocide of Yazidi people
Mm-hmm.
and sexual slavery of Yazidi people. And this happened in 21st century by somebody who was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. And I don't see any international outcry for Obama being directly responsible for Yazidi servitude and genocide. So yes, these things do happen. I want to move away. We don't want to be stuck here. We have Christina here, and Christina, you want to say anything or make your observations or comments or questions?
Sure. So I agree with a lot that you're saying in terms of when does this exploitation become a matter of civil rights? And how can we ensure fair treatment of these people to make sure that they have access to health care and safe housing? Because once they are across a legal boundary and in another country, then they are subjected to those same kind of rights. So what kind of rights are they eligible for? Does this go into possible refugee protection? And in terms of having done some work with people subjected to human trafficking, a lot of them are afraid to disclose what's happening to them, although they perceive that they're working unfair long hours, like 12 to 16 hours a day. For example, one difference that was not considered human trafficking or exploitation was when I worked at an amusement park many, many years ago. And college kids from Ukraine were getting internships at this amusement park, and they voluntarily worked 12 to 16 hours. And after working over 8 or 9 hours, I was starting to feel a little tired. And I said, how can you guys do this? Work all of these long hours? And they said, it's the only chance that we have to make a living wage, save that money and send it home to our families. So that was by choice, and they were provided shelter and housing and the other kinds of benefits that I was eligible for too, like healthcare. They could sign up for the health insurance with that company. That was a far cry from some of the clients that I worked with who they had to basically be in a life or death situation before they could receive medical care, because whoever their handler was did not want them to receive urgent medical care. And some of them were getting very sick from sexually transmitted infection or an untreated bacterial infection of some form. And so now we're trying to educate frontline staff to be more aware of how to identify if someone is a victim and what kinds of questions to ask so that they feel safe to open up and say, I don't really feel safe at home, and this is why. I've been trying to get medical care for 3 months now. I work 16-hour days. I don't have health insurance. I don't have a state ID. I have no way to prove who I am or where I come from. And I think those are the foundational principles of, how can we discern who is in trouble and who is not.
Thank you, Christina. In last seminar, you did talk about our shared experience about human trafficking from China, and that still is very poignant in my mind. So thanks for your comments. We have Professor Nidhi Shandurkar joining us for the first time. She has joined as volunteer faculty for our fellowship program. So Professor Nidhi, do you have any comments or questions? Please go ahead.
Thank you, namaste, and good morning to everyone from India. It's good to join this very insightful and informative session. I would like to congratulate Ripudamanji on an excellent, comprehensive presentation on a very important topic, because I think he was able to trace the historical antecedents of slavery and also talk about some very important contemporary developments. And I would also reinforce Dr. Adityanjee's suggestion that you must get this published so that students and faculties can use your writing as a resource material. So I just have one brief question, and that is about the role of the state. I think in Ripudamanji's presentation, he spoke of a lot of international treaties, conventions, legal arrangements that are working to address the problem of slavery in the 21st century. So I see state at the center of this arrangement, because state is a legitimate authority and power which can work to implement these rules and regulations, by way of which we can resolve this issue of slavery. But do you think that there is over dependence on the instrumentalities of the state, and there are other institutions, mechanisms, and other areas that we can look to? Because we know, despite the enactment of laws, treaties, conventions, and despite the commitment that the international community has placed on eradication of slavery, it is still rampant. Sometimes it makes news, but sometimes it does not. So what could be some alternative mechanism so that there is a little less dependence on state power, governments, and mechanisms? Of course, they have a very important role to play. But who are the other players who could come to the forefront and ensure that human rights are respected, they are not violated, and we can address the question of modern day slavery? Because it is such a paradox. We are living in the 21st century, and we see the discourse around liberty, freedom, rights so vociferously around us. And yet, a lot of us are so unaware about these rampant practices of slavery happening either in our own country or around the world. So, I would just like to understand what other mechanisms and what other institutions can play an important role apart from state machinery.
Ripudaman, do you want to make the first stab at the question, or you want me to go ahead and answer? It's your choice because you have done the preparation. I would like you to give your perspective, and maybe then I can give my perspective.
Um, yeah, that part is already covered in my presentation. That every individual has a responsibility and should have commitment to basically push back any form of slavery and identify and try to stop it or abolish it in any form. So, but yes, at the end of the day, that individual is also a law-abiding citizen of the state, and the state should have uh, some strict regulations. Um, yeah.
So thanks, Ripudaman, for your response. I think I'll compliment Professor Nidhi for asking this question. I think this is a very, very pertinent question. So Ripudaman mentioned that each individual has responsibility, which is very good. We have this binary state versus individual, but it is not a binary. It's a much more complex situation. You have multiple stakeholders as far as slavery is concerned. So the stakeholders that others have the locus standi to intervene are the civil society organizations, corporate sector, and I'll give you each of those with certain examples, how this can be done. And lastly, the vague word, international community or international pressure. So at an individual level, it's my responsibility not to, quote unquote, participate in slavery by any means. So if I know that certain cotton shirts made in China, though they are cheap, but they are product of slave labor, then it is my conscience responsibility not to buy a product made in China. So that is one way of dealing with the situation. United States imports almost $140 billion worth of products every year from China, which has been implicated as made by slave labor. Now, yes, it is government's responsibility to interdict, have certification, and yes, there are laws. But if American civil society stops buying cheap made in China product of slave labor products, I think you will reduce the demand, and once the demand is reduced, the supply will reduce, and China will be forced to change its practice and not use prisoners and slave labor in concentration camps in the manufacturing process. So that is civil society. At corporate level, there are 83 multinational companies that are based in United States, but have their factories overseas in China and Vietnam. And now I'm not saying that every factory involves forced labor or slavery, but it is incumbent upon those corporate entities, which again sometimes have wink, wink, nod, nod situation. So that has to be done at corporate level. At parental level, family level, we know that children from the geographical region of South Asia are abducted, kidnapped, trafficked to Middle East to serve as camel jockeys in camel races. And these children are starved, and the reason they are starved so that they do not put on weight, because the camel jockey has to be very light, and there's a total wink wink nod nod situation. Everybody condones this trafficking. Sometimes poor families will send their children to Middle East to serve as jockeys. So there's complicity at multiple levels. And the importing countries, they have cultural practices that they can very well stop, but they don't, because they are, rejoicing the poor fortune of poor people who are not their compatriots. So you see in all these examples at different levels, different parts of society could act, not just the government. I will give you another example. Institutional culpability. We know that there is sexual slavery and sexual exploitation of women. And it's the religious seminaries that have been heavily implicated in this sexual exploitation of women, especially nuns. Yes, there's a government responsibility, but when you have a situation that sexual exploitation of nuns has led to forced pregnancies, forced abortions, suicides, yet the part of the society refuses to change for whatever reason and protects the perpetrators of these heinous crimes. So again, this is an example at what level the society can intervene. Okay. There are cultural practices in Afghanistan and northwest Pakistan, and this cultural practice is bachabaji. It is exploitation of young boys. It's a systematic sexual exploitation of young boys, and in those countries is the norm. Nobody, again, it's a conspiracy of silence. Whose responsibility is that? It's a society's responsibility. If you continue to foster that tradition of bachabaji. And lastly, I would say, I said if the governments are not the ultimate instrument, there's role for international community. At least now the international law has been redefined, and there's a new concept called R2P. R2P stands for responsibility to protect. And if you know that some kind of human rights violation is going on in a country, international law does allow you to intervene and make changes, make amends, so that whatever exploitation, if genocide is going on, yes, you do have R2P. But if severe exploitation, sexual slavery are going on, just that what happened with Yazidi people, when international community closed their eyes wide shut and did not do anything, That was a failure of international community. So there are different levels, and each level, different stakeholders have responsibility to intervene and correct the system. Now that is when we are speaking of an ideal world with altruistic and virtuous people, stakeholders. But we know that the word is very bad. And that's why you need conventions, you need rules, you need laws, and you need policemen, and you need securities, and you need actually a legal jurisprudence system, because somebody out there will exploit the system and take advantage of the system. I hope, Professor Nidhi, I have answered your question.
Yes, sir, very much. I think there are new points to ponder about. If I may just briefly add, like during the presentation, it was very clear that there are economic incentives for slavery. So I think that's why the whole system is so well lubricated, and that's why it continues. But we also need to explore the social, cultural, ideological, and religious reasons and forces behind the systematic promotion of slavery in different parts of the world. And I'm also quite perturbed by the silence of the media on this issue. Because if there is a systematic and very strong media and civic awareness campaign, like it is around caste issues and caste discrimination in India, like it is around the topic of racism in America, we do not find such an intensified, very a prominent public awareness or media campaign around the issue of slavery in world media, not just Indian media. So I think that would also contribute to raising awareness on the issue, and probably the point you mentioned about multiple stakeholders. If all stakeholders, apart from the government, can play their role, then probably we are leading towards some resolution of the issue. I can think of Uyghurs in China, and there's hardly any voice being raised about the conditions that they are living in. So yes, multiple factors and very important points as takeaways for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Nidhi. Just by the way, ICHRRF did do a symposium on Beijing Winter Olympics and human rights violation by China, in which we did invite Uyghur activists to talk about, the human rights violations of Uyghur people. So whether media is silent or not, ICHRRF has not been silent. Yes, Professor Rao, you want to?
Just one more quick question. I won't take much time. Who defined the concept of slavery first? Who was the academician who defined slavery? You can't put everything under this broad slavery stuff, because that will never go away now, what all you talked about.
I'll let Ripudaman answer that, because I think he went through, when modern definition of slavery came. So Ripudaman, just give that.
Yeah, so are you talking about definition of slavery in the modern context?
Yeah, because how the blacks were brought here, that slavery and all that. But slavery, as Adityanjee was referring, untouchability, that this everywhere, migrant workers, there's so many different forms. We should give it different names.
The modern definition of slavery, just read that out. You had presented it earlier.
Yeah. So there's a paper by International Labour Organization, was in 1992 publication, I guess, where they defined or recognized, sorry, in 2000, year 2000, they recognize, they provided the definition and recognize the state of mind is also a form of slavery. And it's part of the modern form of slavery. So This
Professor
is
Rao,
the
I can
concept and their practical implications. That's the name of the paper, where they have uh, listed the facts and the annual profits related to the slavery. Yeah, go ahead, Adityanjee. Sorry,
So I can send you the exact reference later on, Professor Rao, about the modern definition of slavery. Carl, you have been very silent, and I want to give you time to make your comments. I'm going sequentially, and
No, thank you, Dr. Adityanjee, and I really had a lot of takeaways from each person's questions and answers. But I think what I wanted, what was running through my mind, was already touched upon by Professor Nidhi when I mean, you mentioned institutional culpability, and then apart from the economic incentive, she alluded to the cultural, and then the role of racism and the role of religion specifically. So, just in terms of my comments, I'll just speak on the last two, the link between slavery, racism, and religious philosophy. Like, even if we look at, for instance, apartheid in South Africa, which is like a totally institutionalized system of enslavement. Over there, a lot of its roots it was, of course, based on race, and a lot of its roots were in a Dutch Calvinist theology. And that goes back to, again, original Hebrew theology, which also then finds its way into Islam and so forth. And of course, the Calvinist Church now completely disavows any of that theology, and it has reformed itself in many ways. However, even today, forget about slavery, even for a regular job, kind of job that I do, if a person like me, a black person, and a white person of European descent were to go to, say, a Gulf country, Middle Eastern Gulf country today for the exact same job with the exact same skill set, and if all three of us got a job, our pay scale, though, would be different based on our races. The black person would be paid the least, I would be paid a middling wage, and a white person would be paid the highest wage. Now, this is not because of any kind of relative wages. The white person does not have to be from a wealthy society like America. He could be from some poor East European country, maybe from Albania or something. But he would still get a higher wage based purely on the color of his skin and his race than the black person, or even than a colored person like myself. Or even if we talked about sexual slavery, yes, women from Sri Lanka, Philippines, Pakistan, and so forth, they go to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, and they are made into housemaids and sex slaves. However, there's also a huge number of women from Europe and North America who go to Saudi Arabia. Most of them not as sex slaves, but as wives. In fact, the last 4 generations of Saudi Arabia has sort of, bought wives attracted wives from these countries and bred them. In fact, if you go back further through the Middle Ages, a big chunk of slavery carried on by the Ottoman Empire and other Middle Eastern empires was white sex slavery, the trafficking of white women from Europe into the Middle East. And while some of them were just purely as sex objects, but the vast majority of them were bred. What is the reason for this? Why is there a difference in the treatment? Or even if you look at Israel, the state of modern Israel, at one point, the way that non-Ashkenazi Jews were treated by the white Ashkenazi was very brutal. Their children abducted. I mean, they were treated no better than slaves. Today, the situation is much better, but however, systemic discrimination continues in Israel. The reason for that, of course, comes from theology. There's this originally from the Hebrew Bible. It's the story of Noah and Ham, Shem, Japheth, and that idea that color of skin specifically and race is something to do with one's spiritual potential, and there are degrees of human beings and different stations. So you have, and black people are meant to serve the other two types of the white and the brown and so forth. So it all goes back to that theology, which is still state theology across many countries in the Islamic world. And so that's why it is still by law permitted in many Islamic countries. So that's something I just wanted to bring out, that just like in South Africa, you had the involvement of the Calvinist Church, which then had to be reformed. It was attacked and it was reformed. That's something again that would have to happen in at least this part of the world in slavery. In China, it's a different matter. Sex slavery of Korean women by Japan was a different matter. But over here, especially when it is coming from the mold of religion, it requires a special handling, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, for your observation and comments. We had a very rich discussion. We are left with only 5 minutes. So in those 5
May I
minutes,
just briefly respond to Carl?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, Carl, thank you for bringing up this very important point. And that's exactly why I brought up this question about the role of the state. Because if slavery is deeply embedded in theology, in religious ideas, culture, religious scriptures, which becomes then the basis of how we lead our lives, how culture enacts in societies, then how is law going to be able to deal with this problem? Because we all probably acknowledge that religion and culture still play a very important role in contemporary societies, and especially in monotheistic faith practices where religion is above everything else. So, if religion, theology, and culture become the source of slavery, then according to me, law is going to play a very limited role, especially if legal understandings and legal practices are inspired or are derived from religion, law, religion, culture, or theology. And I think we are not doing enough to address this question of religious ideology, cultural ideology that kind of endorses slavery to the extent of legitimizing it, normalizing it, because even lawmakers are kind of skeptical and afraid to address these questions that touch upon the religious and cultural antecedents of slavery. So thanks for bringing up that important point, and that's a whole Pandora's box probably that we are opening up by discussing the role of religion, ideology, and culture and how it legitimizes slavery. So it's not just economics, but it is so much more.
Thank you, Professor Nidhi, for bringing those issues. I'll just make a couple of points in the same direction. So, role of religion, and it is happening that in the seminaries, I'm not going to sort of, point fingers. So when poor people give their children to the seminaries, religious seminaries, there are instances of sexual exploitation, physical abuse, because those are the captive population. And in the days and age of internet, some of these videos are surfacing from madrasas where young boys are being physically abused or sexually abused because poor parents just gave the children because they could not support them. So again, there's a role of society in a religious context, and I think the law should intervene, and just because something is culturally or religiously sanctioned does not make it right. Second, other extreme is participation in Western NGOs in sexual exploitation of children by controlling the adoption processes and orphanages. So I know that missionaries of charities were implicated in selling of babies and selling of children. So again, we talk about a utopian world and democracy is the best form of government, but democracy is exploited by bad people. We need to understand that. So sometimes it requires an extra effort by civil society groups and vigilante groups who monitor these kind of abuses, because sometimes, and not sometimes, all the time in history, uh, religion has been exploited to the sort of favor of the establishment. So we have to understand that just because we are living in 21st centuries, those practices haven't ceased. It's a very big topic, but Ripudaman has done an excellent job in giving a very detailed exposition on slavery in 21st century. And Ripudaman, I'm not going to end with you till I get your paper in reference form, because it will make a very good reference for future. I thank all of you
Sure,
for
sir.
joining Friday evening here in US from 9 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. and 6:30 a.m. in India for Professor Nidhi. But it has been a very lively discussion, although the number of people is small. It's been intellectually very stimulating. I will just remind that on Saturday morning, 11 a.m. in US and 8:30 p.m. in India, we have our report release ceremony on ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide of minorities in Bangladesh. So if people have time, please join. I think it'll be worth your time. And with that, I'm going to close this session. Thank you, everyone, and namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank you.
good night. Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.